Stone Cold Prose, building better words.
Hi guys, welcome back to Stone Cold Prose, where we build better words, better thoughts, and better men. I'm Miles Watson, novelist and author of such award-winning series as Cage Life, Sinner's Cross, The Chronicles of Magnus, and now, Something Evil. I worked for 12 years in Hollywood, 10 more and counting in criminal justice, and now I break it all down and build it back better. So let's get into this. In the last few months, I have been rewatching the classic TV series Law and Order. The series debuted, you may remember, in 1990 and ran until 2009, which is pretty staggering in itself, but it subsequently returned to the airwaves and continues to churn out new episodes even as I write this in 2026. Like many Gen Xers, I watched it religiously for 12 years or so and then gradually lost interest as my favorite characters went west one by one and the storylines became increasingly ripped from the headlines and thus kind of had this sensationalist rather than dramatic flair. That having been said, I'm almost 13 seasons into the rewatch and I'm still enjoying myself quite a bit. But one unexpected effect of the rewatch is that I have discovered the series is also a time capsule of sorts. Debuting in 1990 and shooting a great deal of its scenes on location rather than on sets and sound stages, it's kind of an unintentional record of New York City over the years. Now, I'm prone to nostalgia, often painful nostalgia at that, and I must confess that the atmosphere of the 90s, seeing it again, left me kind of aching for this time gone past. But I was equally unprepared for what happened to me emotionally when I got all the way to season 12, which ran from September 2001 to May of 2002. It's important to understand that during that time I had a connection with New York City, which I had not experienced before any time in my life, and I've never experienced since. Though I was actually employed as a supervisor in the district attorney's office in a town in Pennsylvania at the time, I was actively undergoing the NYPD's lengthy hiring process, which necessitated numerous trips to the city, often on 24 to 48 hours notice. At the same time, I was making frequent trips to Jersey, to Long Island, to see friends and attend weddings and all that. So in short, my focus was on the Big Apple and its surrounding areas, which I assumed at the time would be my future home. It also so happens that my physical agility test was scheduled for September 8th, 2001, and I remember that day vividly. I woke up at 3 in the morning, I drove about 300 plus miles to New York, and arrived after dawn on a day of incredible beauty. Blue skies, white clouds, crisp temperatures, the city was still asleep, the streets were virtually empty, and with plenty of time to kill, before I drove over to the police academy on East 23rd Street near the FDR, I nosed around lower Manhattan for a good while. And at one point, I drove right up to the Twin Towers, whose size staggered me. Now, I had been in the towers before. I'd actually even ridden that endless super speed elevator to the observation area on the roof. But that was in 1993, and I'd forgotten their immensity. Now, getting out of my car, I remember standing alone on this empty street on that beautiful morning and staring upward at the tower until I was dizzy, and then climbing back into my Explorer and heading over to the academy. A few hours later, I departed the city, and as I drove away, I saw the towers in my rearview mirror and said aloud, "That's going to be my view when I live here." Well, 3 days later, I watched those towers fall from a television in the district attorney's office 300 miles away. 24 years after that, I socked season 12 of Law and Order into my DVD player. Yes, I will never abandon physical media. Don't even come at me. I was expecting just to be entertained, but what I got in season 12 was a trip down memory lane, a trip to an America which no longer exists, and which may never exist again. You may remember, if you were there, that following 9/11, you could not, for many months afterwards, go anywhere without encountering a profusion of American flags that would just defy belief. I was alive during the bicentennial celebrations in '76, and I remember the orgy of patriotic fervor, but it didn't even rival September 11, 2001. Every town I went to, flags, bunting, it was everywhere. Residencies, government buildings, everything was draped with American flags, red, white, and blue colors, and this applied to every overpass that anyone drove under, anywhere. Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, New York. It was all the same, covered in American flags. I was so struck by that profusion of colors that I remember wandering the streets one day in my town, snapping picture after picture on a real camera of innumerable copies and versions of Old Glory fluttering from lamp posts, building facades, windows, you name it. It was a time when, for a brief moment, Americans forgot their political, racial, ethnic, and class divisions and united into a red, white, and blue fist. People called family more often. They made a point of checking on their friends. A lot of formalities between people were dropped. A lot of old animosities were shoved aside. The military, police, and fire services were placed on a pedestal instead of getting kicked into the gutter or ignored like usual. Young men flocked to recruitment offices. In the wake of this, 21st century Pearl Harbor, it was as if the whole nation of 300 million people had suddenly remembered who they were and what they might be if they lifted their heads from the day-to-day routine and the meaningless grudges which occupy most of their lives. The episodes of Law & Order that I watched, shot in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, reflected this mania of tribal identity. In episode after episode, the camera work contrives to make sure an American flag is visible in every conceivable shot. It may be in the form of a lapel pin, it may be in the form of a proper flag, it may be in the form of a poster or bunting or what have you, but it's always there. Foreground, midground, background. An ever-present reminder of national identity, love of country, and righteous anger. Now, I had quite forgotten this in the years gone by, just as I'd forgotten how so many of us in the criminal justice field sported that USA lapel pin on our blazers on court day. But what I'd forgotten so completely that it was as if it had never occurred at all was the sense of unity, of shared identity. All my life, I'd wondered what it was like to live in the America of 1942. And lo and behold, here I was living that in 2001. What's more, the episodes I saw were full of experiences I shared. In the months after 9/11, I visited New York many, many times to facilitate my journey into the NYPD. My first visit stands out in my memory because right after the attack, the streets were crawling not only with police officers, but National Guardsmen in combat uniforms toting assault rifles. There were crash barriers erected in front of many public buildings, and this sense of tension, mixed with purpose, lingered in the air wherever I went. It was the closest thing I'd ever experienced to a real war atmosphere. And there it was, time capsuled on my television screen 26 years later. In one instance, for example, Jack McCoy and Serena Barstow, the characters, are walking through a security line to get into the courthouse, something that you never saw once in the 12 previous seasons of the show. And another, a guardsman, a National Guardsman, stands by a crash barrier on the courthouse steps. The barrier itself is covered with red, white, and blue bunting, and he's got a machine gun. If there's a single image that sums up the feeling and atmosphere of that time, it's that image. Now, obviously, a certain amount of post-9/11 security measures that were supposedly temporary became permanent fixtures in our society. But for the most part, what struck me about what I saw on screen now was the temporary nature of all this unity and all this fervor. It lasted no more than a year to a year and a half, and it ended decisively when Bush made the decision to go into Iraq rather than focus on Afghanistan. This decision drove a wedge into the just-healed fracture between left and right, and split it so violently that, like tectonic plates, they continued to move away from each other year after year. The right moved slowly further to the right, and the left moved somewhat more quickly to the left, until those who wanted to remain at the center were basically straddling an ever-widening hole that threatened to swallow them unless they jumped to one side or the other. Displays of overt patriotism or nationalism soon became limited once again to the right, while the left retreated deeper and deeper into its strangely anti-American globalist agenda. The American flags came down everywhere. The bunting was removed, to return only on the 4th of July or Election Day, if then. The lapel pins were taken off and consigned to desk drawers and then lost or just thrown in the trash. Gradually, the American flag was cropped out of the frame, literally and culturally, and Americans returned to their baffling need to take sides against one another. The legacy news media did what it's always done in modern times, which is to work feverishly to exploit that division, to monetize it, to package it in blocks for sale as airtime, a commodity like pork bellies or wheat futures. As the saying goes, I don't miss 9/11. I don't miss the shock and the horror and the pervasive fear. I don't miss discovering that I myself knew people who didn't make it out of the towers that day. I don't miss feeling that I was living in history and that living in history was scary and full of dread. But as the saying also goes, I do miss 9/12. I miss the contraction of 300 million individuals into a single savage tribe, not to be messed with, a fist ready to smash the originators of the foul deed, a tribe that put aside all of its substantial differences and assumed a shared identity that, like Christmas spirits, seemed to make us all better people. I miss it because I have not experienced it since, and because I fear I will never experience it again. More and more, I feel that a huge part of our population is irretrievably lost, either to mindless, dangerous nationalism, which is just patriotism with all the virtues left out, or an even more mindless, perhaps even more dangerous neo-Marxist globalism. More and more, I feel our people do not even know what it really means to be Americans, because they've either forgotten or they never lived in an America that was all for one and one for all. But I remember what it was like, and I miss it. Folks, if you enjoyed today's video, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, hit the notification bell, and remember to check out my books. They can be found on Amazon under my name, Miles Watson. I'll see you next time, and until then, stay cold, and remember the way it was when.